Hello and welcome to week 3 in History of Psychology, where we're taking on chapter 3, Physiological Influences on Psychology. So in the history of psychology, we're looking really at the field of philosophy. The really deep roots of psychology are now joining with medicine, the leading area of understanding of the human experience. And of course, the focus is going to be on biology and physiology, understanding this thing that we call the brain. Right at the beginning of the chapter, I show you, the first, as off as it was, phrenology, which was the analysis of the bumps on the skull and corresponding those to specific skills and talents and personality traits, was pretty off, but it was the first time in which the idea that different parts of the brain were responsible for different aspects of thinking. That it was the first time that really came to the front, and so it's in terms of the evolution of ideas. It was actually an important step to move from it's just it's that emotions are happening in the heart, and that the brain is just one mass of the same stuff. It's an important step that we had phrenology to kind of alert us to the fact that there might be different areas of the brain. Now, with that, the experimenters in physiology began to make efforts with the technology of the day to understand what parts of the brain do what. And of course, it's a little bit of the dark history of psychology, but using animals, individuals would try to understand the brain through a process called extirpation. Now, what this meant is they would take a living animal, they would purposefully damage part of the brain, and then observe the behavior. So, whatever behavioral changes from the norm were attributed to the part of the brain that they damaged, which, kind of sucks for the animal to do that. But that was the beginnings of trying to understand the different functions based on the locations in the brain. The next one was the study of, and there's some interesting period history about this one too. The study of cadavers, humans who had died, and going into their brains and examining their brain after they died to look at anatomical features that may correlate with their behavior that was observed when they were alive. Now, this effort, of course, was controversial for some interesting historical reasons. For one, in the places where Christian faith was predominant, most of the West and Europe, the idea was that the body is sacred and should not be cut up. So the focus of this was on the bodies of persons who were in institutions, whether those were mental institutions or whether they were prisons. Those individuals, they assumed, we're going to hell anyway, so we might as well use those bodies. Now, interestingly enough, if the person was in an institution or the person was in a jail, there was actually a little bit of documentation of what their behaviors were, because they were being supervised. So that created this sort of perfect storm of who are we going to look at? What brains are we going to look at? Can we find the mental illness in the brain? Can we find the deviance and criminality in the brain by examining these brains after the people have died? So we have extirpation and we have autopsies, developing this further understanding the structures of the brain. Later, as we start introducing more and more technological changes, we started to be able to measure the living brain, the electrical activity, the blood flow, the use of energy. All of these have turned from everything from the EEG all the way up to modern brain imaging, functional MRI. All of those aspects of brain imaging have brought us away from extirpation, brought us away from, certainly there's still some analysis of autopsies and whatnot for gross structures in the brain, but way better for us to be able to actually look at the living brain. So a little bit of the history of how we were starting to understand the human brain. This really is the beginning of an experimental psychology. It's this kind of testing hypotheses. Particularly if you look at the first one, that extirpation one was like, okay, this is we destroy this, what's the effect? We destroy that, what's the effect? If I destroy that same space again in the brain, do I get the same effect? There's kind of experimental method of that. And then thankfully we move into the modern era where we can put people into different psychological conditions and we can look at the active live brain and what it's doing when people are in those particular situations. All of that has resulted in the current highly detailed map that we have of the brain. There's also the last method, of course, is brain stimulation, was actually to go into a living brain and actually stimulate parts of the brain. This is both an older model and a new model. When individuals are undergoing brain surgery, they are often awake. Now, not always, but they're often awake because the surgeon will utilize stimulation of certain areas of the brain tissue in order to navigate their way toward a particular part of the brain, and they need the individual to report back to them what they're sensing and feeling so they know they're in the right place. But that was certainly a way to explore the brain as well. Individuals that were, if I'm like every time I stimulate this area, their right arm goes up. So that must be the area of the brain that is involved with lifting your arm up. That kind of thing. Okay, so the birth of experimental psychology and an observation I made. I hope you made that observation. What's with Germany? They're all over this. So throughout the text, throughout my course book, you have all these individuals of German descent, German names, lots of Jewish German people, and predominating in this world of science across the board, including the early world of experimental psych. So that brings us to the quiz. The quiz asks you to explain, why is it that German, what were the factors of German culture? Remember when we talk about history, we talk about individuals, and then we talk about social events. Now, what is it about the social things going on in Germany, the culture of Germany, that made it more likely that ideas were going to be coming out of that country? That's one of the questions on the quiz. The second quiz question is summarizing those ways of researching the brain that I just went on. That's the quiz. Now, with all that, one of the factors, and I'm going to give you part of the answer, one of the factors that made Germany such a great place for science to start, really, really doing a lot of work, is a strong ethic of the freedom to express ideas. So if you have an idea, there was lots of support for pursuing research on that idea, both in the government and the universities and whatnot, but also among the population. There was an interest in this. There's a cultural interest in the exploration of ideas. This leads to a modern day discussion about what we now refer to as academic freedom. Now, those particular freedoms, as with all freedoms, we need to make sure that we don't take those for granted. Now, as I record this video, there is a new president in the White House, and like him or not, we're not going to get into that. One of the aspects of this incoming administration is a strong value on limiting the academic discussion and exploration of particular topics, be they critical race theory, diversity within gender, sexuality, that these kinds of things, and there may be an effort to tie that to federal funding that essentially could result in, if KVCC wants to continue to offer federal financial aid, its instructors are going to have to refrain from talking about these topics. And that really puts us into a particular difficult situation of, as intellectuals, wanting to explore challenging topics within our classrooms, but yet this sort of overarching gagging of the intellectual voice. Now, there's no doubt difficult topics can enter into a classroom and they can tank. I'm sure that maybe some of you have had that happen, or people have said something that's controversial, to say the least, and there's no opportunity to challenge it, or it doesn't get challenged, or there's a predominant voice that dominates the discussion, and you might have a different opinion, but you don't feel free to be able to express that, those kind of things. So the discussion, very pointed, kind of connecting this historical necessity for a culture of discovery to the modern era, as to the challenges that we're going to be facing in the near future, to ensure that the discussions of challenging issues can continue to occur within the academic classroom. The academic classroom is a place to go to become uncomfortable with ideas, to have your own ideas challenged. That's one of the aspects of growing into an academic thinking individual, that your very thought processes, your very assumptions, your very biases can come under scrutiny. In the end, you still have to make your own choices, but to put yourself through that process is an incredibly valuable aspect of academic and intellectual growth. So let's talk about that in this discussion. Let's be fair. You may be a fan, you may not be a fan. This is an example of where we can talk about these dicey issues and do that respectfully. Maybe even departing from the regular sort of shouting matches that we hear in the media, and let's talk about it like adults. That we can talk about these things, even if we don't agree, we can talk about things like adults. So that's what the discussion is going to focus on. Early in the semester to do this, but it's timely because of the importance of academic freedom as it played out in Germany during the beginning of the history of psychology. So I very much look forward to this discussion and to the adult ways in which we can discuss these kinds of topics. And I will see you online, and have a great week.